Welcome to this episode of Unraveling Adoption, an intentional space to delve into adoption's complexities together. I'm Beth Syverson. I'm an adoptive mom of a 19-year-old son, Joey, who's in recovery from addiction and who is struggling to find his path. I'm walking beside him while working on my own personal growth and healing. We are committed to helping anyone touched by adoption, and we want to help the general public understand adoption's complexities better too. Today's guest is Kari McHugh, an adoptee and an engagement journalist who is making her mark on the adoption community with her project, Voices of Adoption, which you can find on TikTok and Substack. In this project, she elevates the voices of adoptees and birth mothers. Stay tuned for ways you might be able to participate in this project. Amanda is pursuing a double master's in journalism and engagement journalism at the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. She hopes to be a resource to help other adoptees and also to help other journalists find good adoption data. Thank you for all the work you're doing on behalf of adoptees, Amanda, and welcome to Unraveling Adoption.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so glad to have you here. I'm so excited with all of the projects you're doing. And before we hear about Voices of Adoption and other things you're doing, why don't you just give us a quick summary of your own adoption story?
Sure. So I was adopted out of Buffalo, New York through Our Lady of Victory, and it was a closed adoption. And I was 6 months old when I was adopted, and we really have no idea where I was the first 6 months of my life. It remains a mystery. I'm not in reunion. However, I have had the 23andMe test sitting on my bookshelf since last February.
Oh, wow.
And if there's one thing I've learned about reunion over the last 16 months of talking with the adoption community in my grad program is that it is complicated and should not be taken lightly. So I've been holding off until I have the emotional space to manage whatever's going to come up.
That sounds really smart, because I understand too that it can be great or it can be really bad, and it can be great and then really bad. It can go all different ways. Gotta be, I don't know if you can ever be ready, but in a good solid space for sure before you start doing that. Wow.
Yeah. And with the right support system too. I know there's reunion therapists, and having an adoption competent therapist would be hugely helpful.
Yeah.
I think that plays a big role as well.
Yeah. And your adoptive family, are they still in your life? Are they helpful to you? Are they supportive? Or
So, it's a complicated question for me right now. My adoptive family, they were not currently speaking, but I don't really blame adoption for that. I think they did the best they could with the information they were given, which I was born in 86, and in the mid 80s, people were very much still perpetuating that blank slate theory. And my mom, she was not raised, and neither was my dad, to really value or honor mental health services, So I think it's a matter of they did the best with the information they were given. And of course, there's a lot of things I wish could have gone differently. My sister is adopted, actually.
Okay.
So I have a not blood related older adopted sister, and her adoption was semi-open. So for her, that meant she's always known her ethnic background. I mean, she's white, but I mean like Swedish,
Yeah, Scandinavian. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which kind of white.
Where me, we have no idea.
Oh.
But she's known sort of like what health issues she might be in for, the circumstances around her adoption. And she never expressed interest in finding out more. But then through DNA, her birth mother found her several years ago. And I guess that's something interesting to bring up regarding my adoptive mom is I did have an adoption competent therapist when I was like 21.
Nice.
And it was recommended to me, believe it or not, by my school counselor.
Good job, school counselor. Wow.
Right.
Nice.
He was a sassy British man who got me through a lot of roommate drama that I was dealing with. And he was very helpful, but it's amazing to me that back in like 2007 or 8, I was sent to an adoption competent therapist in Philadelphia when this is really not something that was talked about a lot. And this was sort of my first foray into realizing how adoption could have impacted my mental health. Because I was diagnosed with depression when I was 17.
Okay.
And I've always, like a lot of adoptees, I've always known something wasn't quite right.
Yeah.
I've always felt like the black sheep in my family. And I don't think anyone intentionally made me feel that way. I just did.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I saw this therapist, she was the one that taught me that when we're in the womb, we can inherit feelings from our mothers.
Mm-hmm.
That is where we first start to feel things. And at the time, I kind of wrote it off a little bit. I mean, I believed her, but it was just, I think I wasn't quite ready for that information. I wasn't quite yet on a path of self-development.
Yeah.
Not yet. I was close, but I wasn't there yet. But it never left my mind. And I thought to myself, when I got into sort of unhealthy codependent relationships later on, like, oh, I think I have abandonment issues because I'm adopted.
Mm-hmm. Did you start pushing people away, that kind of thing? Or did you glom onto people?
I was the anxious attached variety. It's interesting though.
Gotcha.
I date both men and women, and I'm anxious attached when it comes to men, and I'm avoidant when it comes to women. And I do think this is reflective of my relationship with my adoptive parents, not just because I'm adopted, but I think it's both. I definitely think it's both. I have like the same physical health issues as my adoptive mom.
What?
So much that we joke about it, you know, where it would be like, you have bunions on your right foot. I have bunions on my right foot. You have fibroadenomas in your right breast. I have fibroadenomas in my right breast. We're both slightly deaf. We're both lactose intolerant. We both have GERD, you know, and
okay, this is your adoptive mom.
Right.
So,
and Sheena would be like, we would joke, be like, huh, you sure you're not lying that this whole time I'm actually not adopted? Which, you know, kind of.
That's like the opposite of the usual joke.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's been nice to have that sort of sense of humor with her. Looking back, I'm a pretty classic example of nurture versus nature. And yet it still feels like I'm missing so much information. And that started to dawn on me when I was denied the BRCA gene test when I had my first breast cancer scare.
You were denied it?
I was denied it because I don't have any family medical history proof that I am at risk for breast cancer.
So they wouldn't even give you the test.
They wouldn't even give me the test. It just is completely backwards. And that's when I started to think to myself, okay, there must be some other things that aren't quite right. That feels like a human rights issue.
Yeah.
And that was sort of one of the main reasons I wanted to do my search for my birth mother, is because I needed more information about my health. As it turns out, 23andMe can only get you so far. It can't read every kind of BRCA gene.
Right.
And I learned that while I was writing an op-ed about why it's messed up when adoptees don't have their medical histories last spring. That DNA is just not going to solve all of it. So it's sort of just like these incremental steps where I started to come out of the fog before I even knew what fog was, and how my parents not having any of this information didn't exactly help some of the issues that we were already dealing with. It kind of just exacerbated some things. But, you know, for all intents and purposes, I could have ended up in a lot of places. I ended up with very, very loving parents. My dad is no longer with us. And this is more of like a most families kind of thing. When you lose a key family member, all of a sudden, it can affect all of the relationships in the family or expose existing things that people hadn't been addressing before. And that was mostly in the dynamic with my sister.
Oh, okay.
So I think when you're two adoptees, you know, I think sisters, it's natural, especially 4 years apart. You can feel a lot of competition with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. But when you're both adopted, I think that feeling of competition gets amplified.
Yeah, I bet.
It's certainly not conscious. I think that's what's so difficult about mental health related issues for adoption is like we could relate these issues to a lot of other things as well, but it might just be that the volume is turned up on things.
Right. Yeah. How do you know what's what? It's so hard to parse it out. And it's easy to just blame everything on adoption, but certainly there are other factors in everyone's life. Everyone's life is complicated.
Totally.
So, but you add adoption into it, and it's like, it can just make everything worse.
Yeah. You know, I do think there is hope and a chance for reconciliation with my family. But right now, for me, it's a lot of soul searching and definitely going through like a dark night of the soul period in my life that I think was a long time coming. And being part of the adoption reform community has been a huge journey. And it's been a wonderful community to become a part of.
It's exciting to be in the part of the adoption community that is really pushing for change and pushing for helping adoptees heal and find healing in this complexity. It's so tricky, but there's so much hope out there and so many good people that are working really hard, like yourself, that are out there in the media trying to help somebody in Podunk, Utah that has no one to talk to about adoption. People like you are out there making things available to them. So I think that's really mostly really positive. Occasionally being out there in the media is a little fraught, but mostly
it is.
Mostly it's
One thing that's been difficult about approaching this as a journalist is I have had a lot of pushback from certain professors, certain editors. I've even had people saying, well, you should be upfront that you're part of this community, that you're an activist. And I'm like, I actually don't know that I would call myself that. It's before I started doing the research, I believed what most people believed. I believed that there are so many children that need to be adopted. Mm-hmm. And I was one of those people that was like, oh, well, why would I make a baby when there's so many children that need to be adopted? I'll just adopt. I'll pay it forward. It's such a great, beautiful thing. Even though I knew it had affected my mental health, even though I knew there was some messed up things about access to medical history, I still thought it was this wonderful thing that I wanted to participate in. And so I decided I wanted to start working with birth mothers because I wanted to do my search. And I thought to myself, I wonder if my birth mom had mental health care. I wonder if she had any support. How is she doing? Has anybody thought about how she's doing? Does anybody think about birth moms?
Yeah, right. You don't hear from them very often, right?
Exactly. And I really wanted to be a part of bringing their voices to the forefront if that's what they wanted. And I had a mutual friend who is a birth parent who relinquished their child within the last decade, I believe. And I got on the phone with them, and Jack seems to be like an example of the queer adoption story that a lot of people would want to follow.
Okay.
They chose 2 dads they came out as trans later. They're very vocal about their story. And I was like, well, of course I want to talk to Jack,
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah. And Jack was the first person. And I was like, oh, but there's so many kids that need to be adopted. And they were like, that's a common misconception. And this first hour-long phone call I had with Jack was just like one myth after another that I'd had about adoption, just being completely blasted apart. And of course I trust Jack. Jack is a writer. They know their stuff. But then as I started to dig into what they were saying for my data classes and looking into the numbers and everything, I was just blown away at how much research there is out there about mental health and adoption, about the business practices of adoption, about coercive adoption practices. There is so much research, and it's just buried. Nobody's talking about this research that is out there.
Wow.
And so I was like thinking, what is influencing this? It's just that the public has gotten comfortable with a certain narrative.
Yeah.
And to be that person who sort of takes away this fairy tale narrative, obviously I'm going to get people who were pissed at me. Or they automatically assume that I'm an activist because I'm presenting information that counters everything they've believed to be true up until that point.
Right. So just asking questions is...
Yeah, for me, I'm like, okay, I'm a journalist and I'm presenting information to you as a journalist. These are the facts. I have followed the facts. And would you call like somebody who's presenting facts about climate change a climate activist? Or would you call them a scientist?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I mean, obviously not anybody who is not a scientist, but you get what I'm saying.
Right. No, I understand. Yeah. And that word activist can be very triggering for some people. It sounds adversarial, but it doesn't have to be anyway. But it seems like we should be able to ask questions about this gigantic billion-dollar industry without getting a whole bunch of pushback. But alas.
One good thing about that pushback has been that it's made me a much better reporter.
Oh, I bet.
Because I've had to present, and if I think it's an adoptee thing, tend to compare. It's not a good habit, I know, but I do tend to compare myself. But like I've noticed that I've had to present more data than my peers, more proof than my peers. Everything I've had to present, I've had to have presented with ironclad facts.
Wow.
And I think that's just made me an incredibly thorough reporter. My final report was 78 pages long.
Oh my gosh.
And my classmates were around 10 pages.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Wow.
I mean, they said there was no page limit. So
Where do you go to find the data? I mean, I know that's something you're working on helping people do, but where do you go find it?
Well, luckily for foster care, that is readily available. The government requires numbers in terms of the reasons for taking children into foster care, how many of those children are available for adoption, how many of them do get relinquished for adoption. They require that data be taken every 2 years.
Oh, okay. But what about infant adoptions?
So that's a little bit trickier because there's like almost no government oversight.
Yeah, it can just be like a handshake, right?
Yeah, for private and agency adoptions, there's almost no government oversight.
Wow.
I've actually struggled tracking down what the government oversight is. I've called several government agencies and none of them could tell me who oversees anything about private adoption.
I had no idea. I thought somebody was making sure, that things were legal and ethical. No,
you would think, right? Because everybody has to answer to somebody. That's what my research teachers were telling me. Everybody has to answer to somebody. You have to figure out who they're answering to. And with private adoption, that gets really, really hairy. And it ends up becoming pretty state by state, but ultimately it's kind of like any other business transaction.
Wow.
It's any other business transaction between two individuals.
That's kind of distasteful.
I mean, it really is, though. It's two individual parties, the adoptive parents and the birth parents. And then the child is a goods transferred.
Oof.
A child is not a party. They're literally the goods transferred in this business transaction. Oof. So in terms of that data, it's difficult. But if we look at mental health, NIH has good data.
That's the National Institute of Health, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I've gotten really into subscribing to academia. If you go to academia, I believe it's academia.edu.
Okay.
I have it like flagged to flag me for any academic journal about adoption.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. And one thing that really helps about going to retreats and going to events is I found a lot of really helpful academic journals there. And also just knowing your Boolean Google search terms really helps.
Oh, yeah. As in saying not to this or.
Yeah, that really helps in terms of finding PhD studies, and then going to events. I found researchers.
Oh.
Maybe they are part of the adoption community or they've just seen a disparity in the system and they've become an ally. But I've met a lot of researchers by going to both virtual and the Concerned United Birth Parents Retreat. And they've sent me some of their studies. And anytime I see an adoptee or really anybody make a stat on TikTok, for example, like, oh, adoptees are more likely to be abused. And I'll be like, hey, do you know where you got that data set? Because I really am trying to keep track of where people are finding these numbers.
Oh.
There's an adoptee, Desiree Stevens, who is amazing in the work that she does. She is with Access Connecticut. So she's part of a movement of adoptees wanting to get access to their original birth certificates.
Okay.
Yeah. And she helped make this happen in Connecticut. And she's the genius who realized that if we have birth mothers working with adoptees, because a lot of times they don't want to unseal birth certificates because they think birth mothers want to remain private.
Right. Okay.
And that's like a lot of thing that like privacy laws, they say is for birth mothers is a major thing that tends to block adoptees from gaining access to their original birth certificates. Desiree collaborated with Eileen McQuaid, and Desiree knows all of the same engagement tactics that I just learned in grad school.
Oh,
so we think very similarly, and her approach is just amazing. But she realized if we have birth parents speak out about what they were and were not actually promised in terms of privacy, that could counter a lot of the myth around birth parents wanting privacy.
Yeah.
And that was a big reason they were able to unseal birth certificates. So anyways, I got off into a huge tangent there, but I've been connecting with Desiree and Eileen ever since I wrote an explainer article about how they work together to unseal birth certificates in Connecticut. And I've turned to Desiree for a lot of feedback and advice because she's been in this space much longer than I have. And what we would like to do is we're going to start sending out information requests. In journalism, we call them FOIL and FOIA requests to different government agencies, state agencies, to try to compile what is going to end up being the Yelp of agency databases.
Ooh, wow.
That's an idea. We've not started it yet, but that's a goal. So that is somewhere where we realize the data's there. It's just nobody's put it together yet.
Yeah, right. It sounds like in a lot of data that needs to happen for the adoption world, there's so much scattered all over the place. And who has time or wherewithal or understanding of the whole system to do that? So it sounds like you have some unique skills in this area.
Well, yeah, what you said about it being scattered, that was a huge reason why I wanted to start the Substack.
Yeah. So the Substack is the voices of adoptees, right?
Yeah. So Voices of Adoption, Voices of Adoption, it was started on TikTok and it's still going on TikTok. And that's sort of like its main hub. We have a sister channel on Instagram as well that's doing pretty well, considering Instagram tends to have much slower growth. So I noticed in the comment sections on TikTok, there were a number of adoptive parents, well-meaning adoptive parents asking questions. And some people are curious about adoption, being like, so is there no way to ethically adopt? And those questions can be very triggering for adoptees, especially adoptees who are on that platform day in and day out, sharing their story. So anyways, TikTok can be an emotional landmine. Like,
I understand that. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, there's a lot of trauma dumping.
Yeah.
And it can be a rude awakening for adoptive parents who are new to the space, who come thinking their questions completely innocent. It shouldn't be a big deal. Or people who are interested in adopting, they think they're being supportive by saying, oh, I want to adopt. That's so great. Thanks for sharing your story. When adoptees are like, have you been listening to a word I've said?
Yeah, right.
Why would you want to adopt after you just heard my story? So it can be a rude awakening for people who would otherwise have really good intentions. Some adoptive parents, there is a fair amount of virtue signaling on that platform, and that's not great. But then there are others, like I've had one guy who keeps coming back to my channel who really just wants to do right by his kids. And I think when you're triggered and you see anything that resembles an opponent to what you're saying, even if it's an adoptive parent, a red flag will go off and you'll treat them as if they're doing something bad.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I get painted with a broad brush a lot of times. Oh, you're an adoptive parent. I can't even talk to you. Like,
right.
The door slammed in my face a lot.
Oh, yeah. I'm seeing this happening. It's going to be absolutely impossible for me to be objective because I'm an adoptee. And luckily at my school, we don't believe in objectivity. It's a myth. You can't be completely objective. But I actually think because I was an actor for 15 years before I went into journalism. And one thing when you train in acting for a long time is you really try to understand somebody else's point of view before judging them.
Okay, good.
The bad guy never thinks he's bad. He's always got a reason. You know,
they think they're right. We think we're, everybody thinks they're right.
Yeah. And so for me, I think it's helped me to remain slightly removed. I can't blame people for getting upset at these questions when they could have been answered already by any number of other videos.
Yeah.
But I also think, do we want people to be educated anyways? We want people to learn, don't we? And people are less likely to learn if you're yelling at them.
Yes. I totally get what you're saying. There's so much triggering and trauma going on that people tend to just throw things back and rah. But yeah, people sometimes really need to know, or people that are lurking and watching this whole dumpster fire going on, maybe they can glean something out of it if somebody is in there saying in a voice of moderation or a voice of, I don't know, is that what you're trying to do? Find that middle ground?
If I'm presenting it as a journalist, I'm just like, look, here's just the facts. And I'm going to present the facts in a very convincing way that you're going to want to learn more about adoption reform and where these accountability gaps lie. And that's, as engagement journalists, what we really focus on, which for those who don't know, like engagement journalism, what we do is we work with communities as opposed to a story beat. So instead of being like, well, I cover, the war in Ukraine or LGBTQ rights, we work with communities to assess accountability gaps and information needs, and then collaborate with the community to figure out how are we best going to fill these gaps. So the first video format was developed with a brainstorm session I had with birth mothers last spring.
Okay. So your first project was with birth moms. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it was all their idea. It's just I adapted it to be with adoptees because once the Dobbs opinion came out, adoptees were obviously, myself included, pretty mad. You know?
And the Dobbs opinion was that leaked document about Roe?
Yeah. So the leaked opinion about Roe, where they brought up the domestic supply of infants for adoption in footnote 46. Ugh. And simultaneously, Mother's Day was about to happen. And I wanted to do a recording session about open adoption to help complicate the narrative around open adoption with birth moms, because that's what they wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And we had a format where it was going to be audio only, because a big problem with open adoption is feeling like you're walking on eggshells with the adoptive parents. You say one wrong thing and they could close up the adoption. A lot of people don't know that open adoptions are not legally enforceable. So I was like, well, let's make it audio. You know, we put our heads together and collectively we realized we should do an audio collage where people can answer the same question, showing that there's a range of experiences and complications around this central question. Mm-hmm. And it would just be audio only so that people could remain anonymous, but audio still gives it more journalistic integrity, because in a formal article, no publication would publish anything that was all anonymous sources. They just wouldn't. It doesn't hold journalistic weight. But on TikTok, we have more flexibility. And with audio, it just adds more of that legitimacy to it.
Yeah, because you're hearing the voice.
Exactly. So that's where we came up with the format. And then Mother's Day happened. And with the opinion leak, the mothers who I was going to do this project with were like, we need a break. I'm emotionally exhausted. An essential part of engagement journalism is listening. Not just listening to what's being said, but also paying attention to actions and then trying to mirror and reflect those actions to show up in a way that the community is showing up. And so I thought to myself, well, adoptees seem ready to talk. And I got on the phone with Desiree, and I needed to have something done for an assignment. But also I wanted to respond to this opinion leak. And so I called up Desiree and I was like, what would you think about me doing this same thing, but having adoptees answer whether or not they think adoption is the solution to abortion?
I'm going to drop into this episode the actual TikTok audio only of the video that Amanda created with many adoptees answering the question, do you think adoption is a good solution since abortion might not be available?
I would say unequivocally and emphatically, no.
I think absolutely not.
The answer's hell no.
No, it's not. Because all you're doing is condemning a child to a lifetime of crazy grief that nobody believes in.
As an adoptee and as a mental health professional, we have a real crisis on our hands just dealing with the adoptees we already have.
Creating these laws and these restrictions are not only going to not create the baby boom for adoption that they are hoping for, but it's also going to create traumatized families, traumatized children.
As somebody who's adopted and also a researcher in this field, and somebody who's had an abortion, it doesn't even make sense to compare adoption and abortion at all. Like, they don't belong in the same sentence.
Adoption is an alternative to parenting. Abortion is an alternative to carrying a pregnancy to term.
To not have an abortion is deciding to go through with a pregnancy. Pregnancies are not easy. They're painful. Some women go through horrible things while they're pregnant.
Adoption is basically, it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem a lot of the time.
Women who are going to be in the position of having to get abortions or not being able to get an abortion are probably going to be disadvantaged women.
I'm a adoptee rights lawyer and an adopted person. It's a racialized adoption process already. How much more racialized will it become?
Adoption is rooted in white supremacy, racism, capitalism, colonialism.
Whether it's a good alternative to abortion is a non-starter for me, because it's not an alternative at all. It's an alternative to parenting.
The one is not an answer to the other one.
They're two completely separate conversations that should not be conflated.
What I don't hear in all of this is that as a woman, I still have a right to my body, period. And as an adopted person, I still believe that for every woman out there, including my birth mother.
And now back to my discussion with Amanda.
This was originally supposed to be on my school's TikTok channel, the New York City News Service, because they had just launched a channel. And at the last second, they were like, oh, you can't include first names. I was like, I pitched this idea. No.
What? Oh no.
No, I can't. And so I reached out to my community again, because again, like key tenet of engagement journalism is listening and having ongoing feedback loops. And I created a survey. I know anonymity is important to a lot of us. Tell me how important it is to you and why. And this way I can show this information to editors and professors, and I can be like, I'm not making this up. And ultimately I had to come up with something, and I asked how we should approach it. I asked them, like, should we start our own channel? Because this TikTok video was supposed to just beta test. I thought TikTok was just going to be a testing ground to make one long video. And then that video blew up on that channel. And it was like, well, I guess I'm going to lean into what's already seemingly working, which is this channel. And I created a Google form survey for people to fill out. And with that first video, I got over 100 people filling out that survey. So some of the data I've collected, because every single survey I put up there isn't just about whether or not they'd be interested in participating in the project. It's also been, where do you think news is falling short when it comes to adoption? What topics should we cover? What information are you lacking? Another thing an engagement journalist recognizes, ultimately, it's always been a journalist's duty to just deliver information to the people. And what information are people not getting that they feel like they need when it comes to adoption? So when I saw adoptive parents and adoption curious people commenting, and then I got really into TikTok over the last 6 months and was just a lot of observing other people's channels, I was like, I think they need their own space. I think they need their own spot. And I'm asking this person for this data set and that person for that data set and this person for their adoption competent therapist list and this person for that organization. And I just had like a billion bookmarks, but no central hub. There was no central hub. And I was like, oh, a Substack can actually be both, because a Substack can be a website where anybody has access to these tabs at the top. And then they could subscribe, and 2-minute videos on something really nuanced and complex, such as adoption and anything related to adoption, has the potential to cause more harm than good. It could.
Yeah, because it's so short. It could be misunderstood or misconstrued. Is that what you're saying?
It could be misconstrued. It could be misunderstood. It could also, like, people have accused me of like, oh, I've only talked to somebody with one kind of experience with adoption. I'm like, you're assuming that the adoptees I've talked to have all had really bad experiences, but that quite the opposite is true. Many people love their adoptive parents and are very happy where they ended up, but they still recognize how it has adversely impacted them.
That's a lot of people I talk to.
Yeah. So I think what is good about creating an accompanying Substack is I've created several tabs at the top where they're curated resources where anyone, yourself included, anyone who's listening right now, can go there, they click on it, and they could add their own recommendation. It's this website called Padlet, and anybody can go to the curated resources page. So it becomes a community sourced resources page, and it's growing. And then there's also a section, terms to know. I don't know about you, but when I first started getting into this community, I was like, what does that acronym stand for? And what does that
so
mean?
Many.
Yeah, there's so many.
And every day there seems to be more.
Same. I'm still figuring it out. Like, I think I just learned that HAP on TikTok means hopeful adoptive parent. I just learned that like a couple weeks ago when I was writing my final report. I just learned that. I think for anybody who's new to the space, it's sort of like speaking a totally different language, and having like a dictionary where people can refer to could be helpful. So I figure any new term I introduce in an article, I'll add to the terms to know. And then I'm taking all of the audio from the collages I do, and I've made a little mini podcast, which is not like you. Like, it's not a real, it's just a home for the audio where it's clean and it sounds nicer than on TikTok. And that's just another way for people to hear the collages, especially if they're not one for Instagram or TikTok. And then there's a Get Involved page where it explains more about contributing to the curated resources. There is a Google form for people to give feedback on the Substack itself and how they use news products, so that I can optimize the news product for this community and for how people might use it. There is a Google Forms sign up sheet for people to sign up for more brainstorm sessions.
Nice.
So that we can keep putting our heads together and figuring out new ways to approach reporting on adoption and these issues. I even included a Calendly link for people to schedule a recording with me if they want to be part of a future collage video, and even one for press, since press has not done the best job at earning the trust of the adoption community with good reason. So I've opened myself up to consultations for other members of the press because I've acknowledged I can't be the only journalist who's aware of this stuff covering this. We need more educated, mindful journalists covering issues around adoption.
Adoption competent journalists, like an adoption competent therapist, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's that. And then the articles, what they're meant to do is they're meant to expand on any new, more curated video I put out. So I've got some quick talking heads videos I put out for answering prompts for National Adoption Awareness Month.
Okay.
And then I've got more elaborate explainer videos or collage videos that will have an accompanying article to just give us more context and expand on what was talked about in the video. This is I'm sort of targeting adoptive parents and adoption curious people to go and check this out. But it's also helpful for people who are in the reform community because there's more resources in one centralized location. But something I really would love to do with the Substack in the future is I would love to pull together a collective of adoptees and first moms and adoptive parents such as yourself who've been in the space and who are looking to change things for the better, where they can get on what Substack now has, which is called a subscriber chat.
Oh.
So what will happen is for anyone who pays for a subscription, they have access to the subscriber chat and all of the archive posts. And then for anybody who's in the collective, they can get on the chat in their free time to answer questions from paid subscribers. And then all of the subscription money will be distributed to the collective members who've been participating in the chat so that adoptees and first moms who are already on social media almost for free, doing all of this emotional labor can start getting paid for it.
Oh, wow.
Because I think that's another issue of equity here. Whereas I've seen Sajo the Adoptee Hack, Sarah Josephine. I've collaborated with a number of times on TikTok. They're amazing. And one reason I wanted to work with them is because the way they present information, while still very fervent and passionate, is almost always backed by some kind of data or article or something.
Okay. Nice.
And so I really love their approach. And this idea kind of came when I noticed that they were trying to figure out how, well, man, I spend all this time and I answer all these questions for adoptive parents. They should start paying me. So they set up like a consultation with me.
Oh,
that is very smart. And I was like, how can we make this happen? You know, not everybody is going to want to put themselves out there for a one-on-one. Maybe they just have a quick question, or when you're new, it can be a little less intimidating to send a chat message. So this is something I would like to develop the Substack into, where this collective, the community is running it, and I'm just the editor.
Right.
And it would be great to have people write guest articles. I've done several Q&As with experts that I'd like to transcribe and put on the Substack. So the community, the crowdsourced resources page, the chat, guest articles. I would want this to be something that is community run. And then again, I'm just the editor, making sure that everything's vetted, fact check, so that it has this journalistic integrity behind it. It's almost like, if you heard of Prison Journalism Project?
No, that sounds fascinating though.
Yeah, so it's amazing. So they give opportunities to people who are incarcerated to write articles about what's going on in the prisons that they're in.
Wow. Okay.
And then they have editors who are outside the system who are just vetting these pieces. And it's a real publication, but written by the people who are most impacted.
Wow.
So the Substack has the potential to become a platform that's similar to PJP.
Wow. I think that your vision for this is amazing. And it's using, you know, the new technology and opportunities for engagement, which we haven't seen before. And I love what you're doing. And I hope it comes completely to fruition for you. And I want to know if people want to hop on board and help you or contribute or participate, how do they find you, or where do they find the Substack? What's the best route to get to you?
So on TikTok, we're at Voices of Adoption. On Instagram, we're at _Voices of Adoption. And on Substack, it's voicesofadoption.substack.com. And you can sign up for a free subscription. And if you respond to any of the articles, it goes directly to me. So I will get it.
You are the person behind it.
Yes. And I do answer my DMs. And for anybody who wants to be a deeper part of the collective, especially since it's so new, I'm happy to comp anybody a paid subscription right now for anybody who wants to be involved, because this is still in its infancy.
Sure. And what is the payment situation right now? If people could pay?
Well, I mean, if they want to, it's $5 a month or $50 a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's minimal, but it kind of gets you engaged. It's more than just signing up for something free. It's like, okay, I'm putting a little bit toward this to say, yes, I'm on board. Like,
yeah. And again, right now, I would love for people to get involved. And I would love to hear what people think about this collective idea. I've kind of just put feelers out there to a couple of people, but I've not really had any deep conversations about it yet, because this sort of light bulb realization about how we could create a win-win by having a pipeline between TikTok and Substack came to me 2 weeks before the semester ended.
Okay. So real recently.
Yeah.
Well, I love that you're thinking in these kind of new, fresh ways. And I'm very hopeful that this would create a very rich community and not just a backstabbing shit that happens in TikTok. It sounds like it would be a more mature way of looking at things with vetting and with, moderating and that kind of thing. So
yeah.
That sounds really
That's one
good.
thing that is huge for me on anything I do is always having moderators. Always, because people are talking about often some extremely personal, often triggering things. There's this idea in engagement journalism, we talk about a brave space than a safe space, because a safe space gives you the feeling that you're not going to be triggered. But if we avoid things that trigger us, we avoid so many things about adoption.
Yeah. You just never want to go anywhere.
To make progress, we can't shy away from that stuff. But what we can do is set a stage where we've collectively come up with ground rules, with community guidelines, where we've decided this is what we've all agreed to. And that creates what we like to call a brave space.
Instead of a safe space, a brave space. I love that.
Yes. So I have community guidelines at the top of my channel. Some of the community guidelines that are in the welcome email for the Substack is that in the chat, no bullying is allowed. Absolutely not on my channel, and really to keep an open mind from everybody, though, to everybody to keep an open mind and give people the benefit of the doubt if you can. And for the live events that I've had with experts, for example, we did a live event on mental health and adoption. We had that on several different platforms, Twitter, Facebook, 4 different places on Facebook, TikTok. And I made sure there was at least one moderator on every platform.
Okay. Did anyone misbehave or was it okay?
No, it was miraculous.
Nice.
Nobody did. And it actually created that brave space, because at the very beginning, before the event took place, I met with all of the adoption competent therapists and the moderators, and all of us decided what the community guidelines were going to be.
Okay.
I asked them what they felt was important. We put our heads together. And then when we opened up the event, I set the stage with those community guidelines.
Okay.
And there was maybe one adoptee at the beginning who was like, I'm here, but I don't have trauma. And I think one person said, try to keep an open mind. And they were like, yep, that's why I'm here. And that was it. That was it.
Okay.
It was an amazing way to engage. I saw mutual respect, and people were really listening and sharing. And we even had a moment where things got so deep and personal, where I suggested we all take a moment to just breathe and sit with what we'd all been sharing. And I think when you set the stage, when you've got people looking out, the community will respond in kind.
I will put all your information in the notes, especially how to get into your Substack and your projects. And I will put that first video that you made about abortion, I'll put that as a link into the notes in case people want to find that. And is there anything else you would like to say or mention before we wrap up?
I think for people who are new in the community and it may be like coming out of the fog, there are ways, I think, of sharing our stories that I'm trying to meet that need where it still feels safe, but also authentic.
Okay.
When I say safe, I mean anonymous.
Okay.
I think coming out about our stories as adoptees is filled with a lot of risk.
Mm-hmm.
That's another block that I've met with editors is like, well, why don't they want to be public? Or like I did this incredible story while interning at StoryCorps over the summer. And their main thing is, why isn't the adoptive son coming out? I'm like, well, a whole host of nuanced reasons.
Yeah.
And I think we just have to keep advocating and keep re-educating people.
Yeah. And when you mentioned earlier that your school counselor directed you to an adoption competent therapist, I was like, ding, 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 ding. That's why I want this podcast to be listened to by everyone, not just people in adoption land. Because everybody has a student or a client or a patient or a friend that's an adoptee that will need that help. And you need to understand adoption competent therapy. You know, these terms and this language needs to be out in the public. I am totally with you on that.
Yeah. It's like you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
So if you're somebody who's pregnant and you were not prepared to be pregnant, and for a myriad of reasons you're not going to get an abortion, when you're trying to evaluate your options, whether to remain a parent or to not remain a parent and relinquish your parental rights, how do you know to search for ethical agency practices if you don't know that there are unethical agency practices to begin with?
Yeah.
I had a teacher who was like, you know, why don't you write a recipe for potential or pregnant people to look at when they're considering placing children for adoption, an ethical agency recipe. And I'm like, that's a great idea if people knew to search for that in the first place.
That's right.
If adoptive parents knew that adoptees often deal with a lot of mental health issues that could be mitigated significantly by the way the adoptive parents approach things. But how do they know that if the agency isn't being honest with them about how adoption can impact it? They weren't with you?
No, I knew nothing until my kid was in the psych hospital. And then I started digging in. Yeah, no, there's so much that needs to be taught. And I really hope everybody that's listening to this episode, please share it with people that are not only just in the adoption community, but people that are your friends that are not adopted at all or not at all touched by adoption personally. It's so important. And share it with anyone that you know that might want to be involved in Amanda's awesome project, Voices of Adoption. I'll put the link in the notes. And go ahead and find Amanda on social media, find Unraveling Adoption on social media, and you can find our website, unravelingadoption.com. And we also have Patreon, patreon.com/unravelingadoption if you'd like to support what we're doing here. And I really appreciate you all listening. Thank you so much, Amanda, for coming and sharing your wealth of knowledge and skills in this area of engagement journalism. It's fascinating to learn about. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And Amanda and I want you all to stay safe.